I've heard Wamkele Mene speaking on many stages, and he does stress the point that AFCFTA needs to go beyond policy and into implementation. Is that shift actually happening? And Patrice, I suppose it's the same thing if you look at Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Are we moving beyond policy to implementation?
Let me tell you, South African companies are the largest trading partners on the African continent, from the continent. We sometimes don't give the CEOs and the companies on the continent the sort of credibility and respect they deserve. They're world class. Many of them are as good as the best in the world. So, and these are some of the things that excited us immensely because, I go to Nigeria, I go to Kenya, I go to Egypt, I go to Algeria, I go to Morocco, I go to Tanzania. I see South African companies there. Of course, I see BRICS companies as well. So I think the key issue is that the governments have to increase their partnerships with the private sector. And these discussions between the governments and the private sectors must increase significantly. And part of the purpose of these discussions is for the private sector to indicate to the governments what sort of impediments, barriers, hurdles are there to the free trade of goods and services on the African continent. But we are immensely optimistic.
We had the entrepreneurial focus today and of course, center stage, small, medium enterprises. To what extent, as you say, the BRICS Business Council has the power to impact regulation, to impact policy?
Let me give you an example. In 2013, we spoke about visas. If I go to China as a businessman, if I go to Brazil or India or Russia or any other part in the world, on the continent, we have to fast-track the visa process. And we understand that there are legitimate concerns about making sure that governments maintain the sovereign control of who comes in and who comes out. We don't just agree with that, we support that as well. But these are some of the low-hanging fruits. We can immediately give preferential access to businessmen from China, from India, from Brazil, from Russia, from a BRICS perspective. Give them visas, allow them to come in and look at opportunities in South Africa, on the continent. And what we spoke about was the reciprocity. The company one of our companies has invested several $billion in India. And India is an amazing place for business, and so is China, and so is Brazil. And
let's stay with this theme for a moment. Are the policymakers open to the guidance that business is giving them? As you say, the low-hanging fruit is priority visas across the grouping.
I've got no doubt whatsoever that the commitment and the will is there. No doubt. What is required is an extreme sense of urgency to translate that commitment and will into effective, pragmatic policy implementation. And politicians have got all sorts of pressures and demands and expectations. It happens with me as well. My son comes to me and says, yes, when the business people call you, you come, and when I call you, you don't come, you take a long time. I understand that. But the bottom line is the BRICS Business Council is a unique platform, a unique foundation for consistent engagement with the governments, with the heads of state, but more importantly, maybe equally importantly, for consistent engagements amongst the business communities to find out if I'm a Chinese businessman and I want to come and invest in South Africa, what problems are you experiencing? And how can we eliminate or reduce those problems? If I'm a South African businessman and I want to go and open a business in India, what are the hurdles and the impediments? The Business Council, part of the purpose of the Business Council is to identify those impediments and with a sense of urgency, eliminate and remove those impediments.
As we remove the impediments, one of the biggest opportunities has to be market access. When you look at it as an entrepreneur and suddenly opening up the BRICS nations as a market, That has to be groundbreaking.
Yeah, but you see, a market, it's an opportunity until you realize, okay, until you invest, and sometimes your investment take 5-7 years before you realize value. So, and this is in this instance where the partnerships with the governments, with the heads of state, with the ministers is critically important, because a lot of our investments are long-term investments. And the appropriate policy, legislative, economic, tax, in some cases even judicial dispensation is critically important. So I have no doubt that there is the opportunities in terms of what we can do, the magnitude of how we can grow the trade, investment, and business ties between South Africa, the African continent, and the BRICS countries. The potential is enormous. But again, sense of urgency, sense of immediacy, sense, all of us, with our governments and with our policymakers, we need to translate these good ideas we have, these big plans, into effective legislative or policy instruments that allows for the effective and free flow of goods and services.
One of the criticisms has been that BRICS, the BRICS Forum, the BRICS Business Council, is still at that talk shop level. And many people on the ground, the man on the street, so to say, or the woman on the street, has said, how is this going to help me at the end of the day?
Listen, we don't have time for talk shops. And that's why I seldom go to meetings or to conferences. I mean, I came today because I've got an emotional connection with the BRICS countries. Of course, I've got ties with the rest of the world. But we've got a history as South Africa with many of the BRICS countries which emanates during the years of our fights for democracy. So that history is very, very important. Of course, we've got the similar history with other parts of the world, but we build on those historical support that they've given to initiatives and the struggle towards democracy. And we want that history we use as a basis to build very strong, mutually beneficial business and investment ties. But I need to emphasize economic growth. I need to emphasize that, let me make a bad example. In football, you've got a football team that plays beautiful football, or some people will say beautiful soccer, but they don't score goals. And at the end of every year, they don't win the cup. And we don't remember the beautiful football you played, or neither do we remember the beautiful policies you've got in place. And the same applies with cricket for India. Tendulkar, wonderful. But what makes him great is because he won. So we've got to do the same in the BRICS partnership. This partnership has to translate in accessible, quantifiable investment and trade ties, and it is doing that. It is.
You mentioned football, and in your capacity as President for the Confederation of African
I just want to add that partnership has resulted in benefits, but in relation to where we should be, there's still a long, long way to go.
Sport as a unifier. This must be something very close to your heart, and you've seen it in action. Again, you brought up the football, and as President of the Confederation for African Football, I want you to highlight that opportunity that sport can play as a unifier.
We went as a family into football as part of our philanthropic obligation. I mean, we are made what we are by the people of this country and the people of the continent, and football is one of the areas where we are trying to connect with the youth and say to the youth, because, you've got to be where the youth is to try and engage with them and influence them in directions that you think is appropriate. So the key for us is Africa has got about 400 million young people between the age of 15 and 25. If we don't give a future to those 400 million people, I mean, the number is 300 million currently, and by about 2030 they expect it'll be more than 400 million. If we don't give a future to those young people, all of us don't have a future. So we use all sorts of vehicles and instruments and tools we have to connect with the youth. And football, like music and various other forces or means, is an important tool to engage with the youth and to say to them, go to school, get an education, study maths and science, prepare yourself for the technological jobs of the future. But also importantly, don't do drugs, don't commit crime. And so football plays an important part in bringing people together as well, and uniting people across racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural ties.
You've been present throughout today's sessions. What stood out for you in terms of the conversations? I mean, we've had just transition, obviously the focus on climate change, especially as Brazil moves to hosting COP30. The reality of, as I said, electric vehicles, manufacturing. Agriculture took center stage today. Entrepreneurship, the African Continental Free Trade Area. What stood out in terms of those conversations?
You've got to focus on the detail. You've got to look at the totality of the relationships between South Africa, Africa, and the BRICS countries, and at the heart of which we must identify in which industries, in which sectors, which specific opportunities present or has the greatest magnitude to increase the quantum of trade, and side by side with that, because an increase in trade, an increase in investments results in creating jobs, results in opportunities for further education, results in improving the living conditions of our people. And as I said, that's what should lie at the heart, and that is what indeed lies at the heart of our relationships. But I still think that, let me give you an example. The trade between South Africa and China was about 28 billion in 2013. China is the biggest trading partner of South Africa. And as I said, the trade between the BRICS countries in Africa was 342 billion in 2013. The trade between China and South Africa has increased from 2013 to about, from 28 billion US dollars to about 34 billion US dollars. The issue for me is that the potential is to get it to 40, to get it to 45, to get it to 60. What does it take to get the trade ties to increase significantly? The same applies with South Africa and Brazil, Africa and Brazil. You can say the same thing, South Africa and India, Russia, all of the BRICS countries. But at the heart of the trade also is the mutuality. Because I'll go back to China. We used to import more from China than our exports. Over the last few years, our exports to China surpasses what we import from China. Now, we want the relationship, when we benefit, it's not good because we want both parties to benefit. Because if the other party benefits and we don't, it raises questions. The commitment between China and South Africa is immense. It's enormous. The same applies to the commitment between South Africa and India and the rest, all of the BRICS countries, I can say the same. At the heart of that must be the balancing of the trade and investment ties. So that, they buy from us as they do, and I know in 2013 China said to us, we want to buy more, we want to buy more. We were not as responsive or as ready as we should have been. But so I just want to conclude that at the heart of these trade relationships is mutual benefit and a balance between what we import from each other and, of course, from an African perspective, beneficiation. I saw in the notices they don't talk about the mining industry. And yet, if you look at Indonesia, I see Minister Mantashe is here and he's smiling. So I'm saying that if you look at Indonesia, for example, Indonesia emphasized the issue of encouraging beneficiation, but mutually beneficial. And this is one of the things that you, even when you were a mine worker, before you became minister, he was emphasizing the need for mutually beneficial beneficiation.
This beneficiation, again, I come back to, I mean, you have this bird's eye view in terms of all the business that you're doing. Are we beneficiating? Is this starting to transpire? Are we knowledge sharing? You know, we had that discussion again, I referred to electric vehicles and manufacturing and green components. It's wide open for us as BRICS nations to take center stage.
I can assure you, opportunities that makes commercial sense, the private sector in South Africa and on the continent will invest. We're already producing a lot of, I mean, I'm proud to, in Botswana, for example, a lot of the diamonds are being processed and cut in Botswana. In South Africa, a lot of our platinum and a lot of our minerals are being processed and smelt and refined and exported in South Africa. But at the heart of it must be commercial viability and profitability. So I'm confident that, like Indonesia and like other parts of the world, in relation to the mining industry, we have the capacity, the skills, the know-how to build relationships, beneficiate even more, but again, in a manner that's profitable and that makes commercial sense.
The work streams that you referred to are looking at the minutiae, at the detail. They're looking at execution across Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Those reports are forthcoming. There's an annual report, 50 pages, that has detailed every aspect. When
we submitted our report, we wanted to make sure that the private sector, the people who were going to put their money behind what we were saying in the report, could look at the report and make sure that we actually also use the right words. The specificity in identifying industries and sectors, because with their sort of support and encouragement and motivation, that's an excellent foundation, because they have to put their money in China, in Russia, in India, and in Brazil. So I'm happy. I haven't seen the report that has been forthcoming now, but I know that the first report we drafted, there was an overemphasis on a focus of China must tell us what would they like to do in Africa. I mean, what sort of business opportunity would they like to pursue in Africa? India must do the same. Brazil must do the same, because only when both parties, because we can say to them, come and invest in infrastructure. And they say, no, but infrastructure is not a priority. So it's when the BRICS partners identify opportunities of mutual benefit and mutual interest. That's an excellent foundation for the future.
We are awaiting the heads of state.
You can sing whilst you're waiting for them.
You've got the opportunity to lay the context before they walk onto the stage. What do you want to resonate with them?
Well, I must say my time has come and gone, because I think the new business leadership from the BRICS countries, I saw my brother from India. I was working with him in 2013, my brother from Russia, and there's a Chinese delegation, and I saw the gentleman from Marco Polo, and Brazil, you know, India, amazing. So I think they are appropriately qualified, and I say with respect more so than I am, in their document that they submit to the heads of states, to tell them specifically what are the specific industries, sectors, opportunities that they must encourage, but also what policies, what legislative interventions must the BRICS countries introduce to make sure that that the trade between our countries grows significantly, because the potential is enormous.
Well, you've laid the context, and we count down to welcoming them into the convention center shortly. Patrice, always a pleasure. Dr. Patrice Motsepe is the inaugural chair of the BRICS Business Council South African chapter, on stage here with us at the convention center.
Thank you.